We're now going to be calling in Rod Bailey. Rod, good morning to you. It's great to have you on the show with us.
Good morning, gentlemen.
It's good to have you here. So, Rod, give us a little bit of just a recap of where we are in the map, in the journey of making a transition from the city into the country.
Okay, so some months ago, we started off with what I consider to be step one is why. Why we are thinking of uprooting our family's life and moving them to the country. In step two, we went on to the question who, and the who is you. So we looked at our need for a rigorous self-analysis, if you like, full and frank examination of our capacities and our abilities. And this led us to a plan. We look at our finances, we decide whether our expectations are realistic, and this including our budget. And then we look at a plan and that we've established through this preparation process. And so kind of now we're up to step number 3, and that is the question what. And here we're talking about what type of property we might need to meet our needs of this moving to the country.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm excited. So Where do we start?
Okay, from my perspective, there are kind of 5 classes of property, and we might see them in some ways as a bit of a ladder. But, okay, so the 5 types are like a weekender, a retreat, a hobby farm, a self-sufficiency property, or we might call them a homestead today. Mm-hmm. And then the 5th one is like a working farm where we actually get our income off the farm.
Okay.
So I thought we might go through each of these different classes and flesh it out a little bit. And then people might be able to see where their current thinking, where it fits with what they're looking for.
Okay. So let's start with the first one. So the weekender, what's that property like?
Yeah, so a weekender is a place, you keep your normal place of residence, but a weekender is a place where you can go and hang out. It might be a remote piece of bush, maybe there's a creek, maybe you've got a shack or a van on it sort of thing. Mm-hmm. It's space to relax, to explore and to play and maybe develop your country living skills a little bit more through the challenges that will come there. And what can be really attractive to this, if you're just going to visit on the weekend, it doesn't need a housing entitlement or a dwelling entitlement in our state anyway of New South Wales. And so these properties can be cheap. Mm-hmm. And so you can buy a patch of bush or a patch of country for 100 or 200,000 Ks, as in $1,000. But it's not a place where you can live permanently. But it might be a first step for some people.
Okay. So what kind of skills do you reckon they can develop? Like chopping wood, these kinds of things, or it's even more planting, like starting a garden? Is that even enough time to do something like that, or an orchard?
Yeah, a garden, that needs regular tending might be a bit of a challenge, but exactly, sometimes, Joseph, it can come down to getting used to living or being in a place that's not noisy all the time, that's mm-hmm. quiet. And learning more about nature and things like that. And this might be a good step for someone who's, when they've looked at their plan for life, they're thinking, well, it might be some years before we can actually make a move to the country. And so maybe we can spend a little money on a property like this and get used to ourselves and the kids being in the bush as opposed to a city lifestyle.
And how do you choose a region, let's say, because as you mentioned, maybe that weekend there in the future can even go up 2 steps and even become like a self-sustainable homestead or so on, in the future. So how do you, location wise, I don't know if we're jumping the horses here a little bit, but jumping the gun.
You are. You're jumping the gun.
Okay, I'm jumping the gun here. Okay, so let's keep it for later then, because I think that one of the big questions people have is, okay,
it is.
Location, how far from the city, how close to the city, the challenges and benefits from that, because of course there's going to be a trade-off. But let's move on to the next type though. So we spoke about the weekender, and then what's the next one?
We have the retreat.
Okay, so what's the retreat like?
Okay, and so it's kind of like the next step up the ladder from a weekender. So you can actually have planning permission from your local council to have a dwelling on it. Now you're continuing to maintain your home in the city or in the town, but this retreat, it may be just a simple humble cottage. But I've known people to have grand homes on their retreat, and they rent it out as an Airbnb in between. So it's the next step. And you go there not just for weekends, but for your annual holidays and things like that. One property Desley and I owned, it was the first property that I bought, was called Terebury on the south coast of Western Australia. And we always intended it to be a self-sufficiency property, but it started as a weekender. Okay. And then it became a retreat. And each time we visited, we developed it a little bit more and a little bit more. We planted trees and we built this until it became a hobby farm, and we actually moved onto it full time. And so the hobby farm is the third class, if you like. And this becomes your permanent home. Typically it might be 5 acres or bigger. There's no limit to how big it could be if the rest of the property is bush. But a hobby farm, you can only manage a few acres of that. Maybe it might be in a rural residential area where all of the properties surrounding are only 5 acres or thereabout. But, typically you've got your house, you've got a home garden, you've got an orchard, you've got a few chooks, maybe have a few beasts, a horse or 2, sheep to keep the grass down. Oh, that reminds me of an iconic Aussie song. Give me a home among the gum trees with lots of plum trees, a sheep or 2 and a kangaroo, a clothesline out the back, a veranda out the front, and an old rocking chair.
That's
this is
kind of like
it's kind of like the Australian dream for a lot of us. It gives us lifestyle that we want, gives us space, it gives us freedom. We're not living under the nose of our neighbours. We've got space for pets, space for a garden and an orchard, space for the kids to buzz around on a motorbike, or maybe there's enough space for the kids to learn to drive when they're only 5 or 6 years old, as soon as they can reach the pedals,
Yeah.
But these sorts of properties are still close to town, close to work, because a hobby farm cannot be your primary source of income.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So it is actually a legal, how can I say, there's a legal term for, it's actually a legal concept, it's a hobby farm. It's something that is recognized by here we are in New South Wales as a specific type of property. Is that?
Yeah, yes and no. For tax purposes, in order to be helped with deductions and stuff like that, you actually need to be making an income from it, and so that can come in on the next stage. Class 4
just before we move to the class 4. So, are you able to live on your hobby farm, or is the hobby farm kind of like a more like a complex nature, like weekender / retreat?
No, when you get to this stage, you're living on it permanently. So you have a home that has, you're on a property with a dwelling entitlement. That's right. Yeah. And so here you are, living in the country and living your life, but still being close enough to town in order to, to
be able to work there if you need
to work and earn income. Yeah. And then class 4 is the self-sufficiency or the homestead sort of approach. It's kind of like a hobby farm on steroids, with a desire to be as self-sufficient as possible. And I must say at this stage, very, very, very few people that pursue this plan actually succeed.
Okay.
And that is to be self-sufficient. Why it's difficult to succeed is because we want the same stuff and lifestyle we have when we are making lots of money. Okay, and the modern lifestyle is expensive, and being self-sufficient is a difficult thing when we want the same stuff and the same lifestyle we have when we're making lots of money. Without going back to the simple lifestyle of my grandparents at the turn of the last century, 125 years ago, it's nearly impossible for me to become self-sufficient in food, clothing, etc. It takes all of one's time and energy, a great deal of skill. I don't want to discourage anyone. I just want to give you the facts.
Yeah.
You know, self-sufficiency is hard.
Look, I once read that the minimum number of people, so you can have you can be actually self-sufficient, meaning you don't need any external factors. It would be at least 50 people, because even like when you're self-sustainable, you're not going to be 100% self-sustainable. As in, like, are you harvesting your own grains, your own wheat, for example?
Right. So you're talking there about a community, and that's impossible. It's as I say, especially if we want all the stuff of modern life we've come to expect, the latest consumer goods, modern vehicles, travel and entertainment, all of that stuff is expensive. Mm-hmm. And so we might have a vision of that, and I encourage people to move towards that.
Yeah.
And many people aim for a permaculture self-sufficient lifestyle. Many people are familiar with permaculture principles. There's fantastic principles in the permaculture umbrella, but it's a popular notion that appeals to very many. But very, very, very few succeed. I personally know an international teacher of permaculture. He travels the world teaching people permaculture principles, and he owns a semi-famous property in Queensland. But he told me he can't make a living on it. He wasn't even self-sufficient. And in order to make it work, he had to teach others permaculture.
Wow.
So
I think I know whom you're talking about. I think I've watched this guy's YouTube channel, which is pretty good, by the way.
His property's actually currently on the market.
Oh,
so,
really?
All of the above classes, the weekender, the retreat, the hobby farm, and the homestead or self-sufficiency, require an off-farm income. And each time, I started this process when I was a kid. My parents had the same sort of dreams that many of us had. At one stage, on one property in Western Australia, Glenorran was a locality. My dad was a mill hand. He worked at a timber mill and he was a teacher. Another one in Northcliffe, he was a teacher and a bus driver. Another one in Pemberton, he was a bus driver and a timber worker. When Desley and I started, Desley taught as primary school teacher and I worked at the WA Ag Department. So we all needed an off-farm income, or some people have successfully achieved a farm-based business, okay? But that's a challenge. But let's quickly look at the fifth category, and that is a working farm, okay, where you're actually making your living by growing things or activities on the farm. And often scale must still require an external income, at least until the farm becomes profitable. We've done this on a number of properties that we've had. But working, profit-making farms are typically expensive to purchase. You're buying the land, you're buying the house, and you're buying a business. Or they're expensive to start up, and they're typically high risk. You're dealing with weather challenges, market fluctuations, commodity prices, competition. And there really are very few turnkey farm businesses, because most of it is in the farmer's head because of his generations and years of knowledge and experience. Okay, but you will see from my experience that we kind of worked our way up the ladder, and you might need to do the same thing. We started with a weekender, went to a retreat, turned it into a hobby farm, and then into a self-sufficiency homestead. And now we are on a working farm where we make a profit most years, and we employ 6 or 7 full-time people.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
What a journey. Who would imagine that, that there could be so much development, and variety when it comes to the type of property that can be developed with moving to the country.
There's a lot to think about. Who knows where on that ladder you might settle? And there are many, many variables, each one potentially critical to our success. And I think all of us should be feeling the need of a senior partner in this noble endeavour. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that the almighty, all-wise, all-owning master of the universe is himself personally invested in our success. And I really encourage anyone who's listening and considering, making a move to the country, that they engage God as their senior consultant, as their financial planner, as their banker, as everything, as they set their faces of flint to do what they feel he wants them to do in their lives.
I think that that's a fantastic advice. Rod, thank you so much. What a great instruction on our series on how to move to the country.
You're listening to the Breakfast Show podcast on Faith FM. Positively different.
With myself, Scaffy,